Hollywood loves its rebels, right up until they become a little too rebellious. In classic Tinseltown, speaking your mind could cost you everything: your career, your friends, your future. But what happens when a star refuses to back down, even as the studio doors slam shut? Some legends chose their voice over their paycheck, and Hollywood made them pay. Curious how far the old guard would go to silence a troublemaker? Stick around, because these stories are far from washed up. Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo didn't just write scripts, he wrote his own rules. At the peak of his screenwriting fame in the 1940s, Trumbo was cranking out hits left and right, with his name lighting up marquees across America. But in post-war Hollywood, a new drama was brewing: the Red Scare. Congress was on the hunt for so-called communist sympathizers, and Tinseltown's golden boys were suddenly enemies of the state. Trumbo, a proud free thinker, was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked to snitch on friends and colleagues. His answer? A resounding no. He refused to betray anyone's privacy, and in one bold move, signed his own professional death warrant. Hollywood studios dropped him like he was radioactive. Suddenly, the man who wrote for A-listers was scrambling to keep the lights on. But Trumbo wasn't one to play the victim. He worked under fake names, secretly penning scripts that would go on to win Oscars. His screenplay for Roman Holiday snagged the Academy Award, but his name was nowhere near the trophy. Trumbo's ghostwriting hustle became the worst-kept secret in Hollywood, and his refusal to be cowed inspired a whole generation of writers. When the Blacklist finally started to crack, Trumbo emerged from the shadows, pen in hand, reputation intact and sharper than ever. Hollywood tried to erase him, but Trumbo made sure his words and his voice couldn't be silenced. In the end, it was the system that blinked first, not the man they tried to destroy. Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was bigger than life: athlete, singer, actor, and above all, an activist who couldn't keep quiet when injustice was on the stage. At a time when Black performers were expected to know their place, Robeson shattered expectations everywhere he went, commanding concert halls and movie screens with his deep baritone and magnetic presence. But Robeson wasn't just there for applause. He used his fame as a megaphone for civil rights and global equality. Robeson's outspokenness, especially his criticism of American racism and support for anti-colonial movements worldwide, made him a target. His refusal to stay silent infuriated the powers that be, both in Hollywood and Washington. The government branded him un-American. His passport was revoked, blocking him from performing overseas. Concerts vanished. Film offers dried up. He became persona non grata, all for daring to ask why a country built on freedom refused it to millions of its own. Instead of retreating, Robeson doubled down, performing for workers and activists, singing over the phone to foreign audiences who couldn't see him live. He took his battle to the courts and the press, refusing to let censorship have the last word. Even as the spotlight dimmed, his courage never wavered. Robeson spent his last years isolated and under surveillance, but he never apologized for using his platform to demand better. Years later, the world would recognize Robeson as a trailblazer and hero. Hollywood tried to mute his song, but Robeson's voice was too powerful, echoing far beyond the red carpets and blacklists. Lena Horne. If there was ever a star who refused to be boxed in, it was Lena Horne. She was pure Hollywood glamour, singing at the Cotton Club by her teens, landing a major MGM contract, and dazzling audiences with both her looks and her talent. But beneath the satin gowns and sparkling smile was a fighter who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. Horne was outspoken long before it was fashionable, using her status to take a stand against the racism that ran deep in both Hollywood and American society. She rejected demeaning roles, lobbied for equal treatment on set, and became a passionate voice for civil rights. Horne called out segregation in the military during World War II, refused to perform for segregated audiences, and openly supported anti-lynching campaigns and civil rights marches. Her activism didn't sit well with studio bosses or government investigators. By the 1950s, Horne's name appeared in the infamous red channels, and the roles stopped coming. She was blacklisted, deemed too controversial, too political, and too much of a headache for the comfort-loving industry. But Horne was never one to fold. She took her talent to nightclubs and the stage, captivating audiences with her powerful voice and presence. Even when Hollywood tried to shut her out, Horne kept the spotlight aimed at justice. Her refusal to play by the old rules helped break barriers for future generations. Hollywood's Blacklist may have tried to silence her, but Lena Horne's legacy proved louder than any band ever could. Howard Da Silva. When the credits rolled in classic Hollywood, Howard Da Silva's name used to be everywhere. Character actor, stage legend, a face you couldn't forget. But Da Silva was also a man of principle, and in the late 1940s, that turned out to be the quickest way to get yourself blacklisted. He was never shy about his politics or his support for labor rights. The House Un-American Activities Committee didn't like that. Called before Congress, Da Silva refused to snitch or play along with the witch hunt. That simple act of defiance made him persona non grata overnight. The studios dropped him fast, and suddenly this versatile performer found himself locked out of Hollywood, with scripts and offers evaporating before his eyes. But Da Silva wasn't done. He took his talent back to the stage, performing in theater across the country and later in London. When he tried to return to Hollywood, he found the blacklist still had teeth. He even filmed scenes for The Lost Weekend, only to see his name erased from the final cut. It would take over a decade for Da Silva to reclaim his space in the movies. When he finally did return, it was with the grit and defiance that made him a legend in the first place. Da Silva never apologized for standing up to power. Hollywood thought it could bury him, but he simply dug in deeper, proving that talent and courage can't be blacked out forever. John Garfield. John Garfield was the very definition of a self-made star, tough, working class, and never afraid to show it. He brought an edge to the screen that Hollywood had rarely seen before. Off camera, Garfield was just as bold, lending his name and time to labor causes, civil rights, and anti-fascist groups. But in Cold War America, a conscience could get you in more trouble than a bad review. Garfield refused to play along with the political games. When the House Un-American Activities Committee came calling, he didn't sell out his friends or colleagues. He wouldn't name names, even as his career and livelihood were put on the line. Studio bosses, terrified of controversy, pulled his contracts and left him out in the cold. Suddenly, the actor who had electrified audiences in Body and Soul and The Postman Always Rings Twice found the phone stopped ringing. The pressure and public scrutiny didn't just hurt Garfield's career, they battered his health. Isolated from the industry he helped define, Garfield's final years were spent trying to clear his name and support his family. In 1952, he died of a heart attack at just 39, a tragedy many blamed on the stress and heartbreak of blacklisting. Garfield's refusal to compromise became his legacy. In later years, Hollywood would try to distance itself from the blacklist era, but Garfield's story remains a cautionary tale. Speak your truth, and you might pay the ultimate price. But to a fighter like Garfield, some things were worth more than a star on the Walk of Fame. Zero Mostel. Zero Mostel was a force of nature, big, loud, fearless, and impossible to ignore. He made audiences roar with laughter in everything from Broadway's Fiddler on the Roof to the film classic The Producers. But during the McCarthy era, even comedy couldn't save you from Hollywood's paranoia if you refused to play along. Mostel, with his wit sharper than a razor, was a perfect target for the blacklist. Mostel was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and pressured to name names. He turned the ordeal into performance art, using humor, sarcasm, and outright defiance in his testimony. But his stand came with a price. Studios closed their doors, and his phone stopped ringing for years. The entertainment business wanted obedient stars, not rebels who mocked the system. Financially battered, Mostel relied on small theater gigs and painting to make ends meet. But his fire never went out. When the blacklist began to thaw, he exploded back onto the stage, transforming Fiddler on the Roof into a cultural event and winning Tony Awards with the same big, subversive energy that got him in trouble. For Mostel, the blacklist was both a scar and a badge of honor. He didn't just survive. He became a symbol for everyone Hollywood tried to silence. In the end, Zero Mostel proved that real talent and real courage can't be kept out of the spotlight forever. He showed the world that you could laugh in the face of fear and still come out swinging. Dorothy Parker. Dorothy Parker's wit could cut glass. She ruled New York's literary scene, then conquered Hollywood as a screenwriter, penning gems like A Star is Born. But Parker wasn't content to just write sharp lines. She used her voice for causes, standing up for civil rights, workers' rights, and anyone being bullied by the powerful. Hollywood, always skittish about controversy, started to get nervous. When Parker's name turned up in the Red Channel's blacklist of supposed communist sympathizers, her Hollywood career was basically over. Producers who once begged for her words now refused to return her calls. It didn't matter that her crime was standing up for justice. The industry wanted silence, not sass. Parker's fame in other writing circles helped, but her film career stalled in the 1950s and never fully recovered. Yet she never played the victim. She kept writing, raising her voice, and lending her reputation to causes she believed in. She even left her entire estate to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the NAACP, a last defiant gesture from a woman who always picked principle over popularity. Dorothy Parker proved that you could lose a job and still win the bigger fight. Her blacklisting was meant to erase her, but instead, it carved her legend in stone, fearless, funny, and never willing to shut up for anyone's comfort. Marsha Hunt. Marsha Hunt was Hollywood's picture of elegance, talented, beautiful, and destined for stardom. By the late 1940s, she was in over 50 films and well on her way to becoming an A-list mainstay. But Hunt had a conscience, and in a time of fear and suspicion, that was more dangerous than any scandal. When the House Un-American Activities Committee came hunting, Hunt didn't hide. She spoke out publicly against the blacklist and defended artists' freedom of expression. It didn't take long for her name to appear in the infamous Red Channel's report. The studio offers dried up overnight. The industry that once celebrated her now turned its back, all for the sin of standing up for colleagues and calling out injustice. Instead of quietly fading away, Hunt used her newfound free time to champion humanitarian causes around the globe. She traveled to fight world hunger, and later became a vocal advocate for homelessness and civil rights. Her career never truly returned to its former glory, but Hunt made a life that was bigger than the Hollywood machine. She was never bitter, just more determined to use her voice for good. Marsha Hunt's blacklist wasn't an end. It was the start of a second act that proved some stars shine brightest when the spotlight tries to leave them in the dark. Geer. Geer was the ultimate character actor, capable of playing everyone from wise grandfathers to wild outlaws. Before he found TV fame as Grandpa Walton, Geer was deeply involved in the union movement, supporting workers' rights and using his platform to call out abuses in the industry. In 1951, Geer refused to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That simple act ended his career in Hollywood almost instantly. The blacklisting hit hard. Geer couldn't get acting work in film or television, so he leaned into his other love, folk music. He created the Theatricum Botanicum, a haven for blacklisted artists to perform and survive. Geer turned exile into a movement, inviting fellow outcasts to join him in grassroots theater and music, and refusing to let the blacklist define his legacy. It took decades for Geer to make his way back to mainstream screens, but when he did, he became the beloved Grandpa Walton, a role that brought him a new generation of fans and a permanent place in TV history. Through it all, Geer never apologized for speaking out or for standing with those who had no voice. Geer's story is proof that when Hollywood slams the door, real artists will always find another stage. Sometimes, being kicked out is just the start of a bigger, better show. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson was Hollywood's original tough guy. He made his name in gangster flicks like Little Caesar, with a glare that could freeze a room. But off-screen, Robinson was a passionate defender of civil liberties, anti-fascist causes, and the rights of his fellow artists. In the climate of Cold War suspicion, being too outspoken could land even the most bankable star in hot water. Robinson gave money to organizations fighting for social justice, never imagining those donations would be used as evidence against him. He found himself called before HUAC, grilled about his politics, and pressured to denounce friends and colleagues. While Robinson tried to explain he was just supporting freedom, the damage was done. His name was never formally blacklisted, but the industry quietly graylisted him. Leading roles dried up, and he found himself suddenly offered only small, uncredited parts. Robeson never stopped acting. He just did it in films that paid less and got less attention. It took over a decade for him to claw back his reputation, finally landing an honorary Oscar late in his life. The message from Hollywood was clear: speak out and you'll pay, even if your face built the industry. But Robeson stayed defiant, saying later, "I didn't cave in. I still think what I did was right." His story is a reminder that Hollywood has always had a love-hate relationship with courage. Robeson proved that even when the cameras stopped rolling, the real performance was sticking to your beliefs. Burgess Meredith. Before he was the gruff voice behind Rocky's trainer or the cackling penguin in Batman, Burgess Meredith was one of the most respected actors on Broadway and in Hollywood. But when the Red Scare hit, even the most versatile stars couldn't dodge suspicion if they refused to stay quiet. Meredith's support for liberal causes and willingness to speak his mind put him directly in the firing line of the Blacklist. In the late 1940s, Meredith was swept up by accusations that he'd attended subversive meetings and associated with left-leaning artists. The result was instant. His movie roles vanished, television work evaporated, and his star power was abruptly unplugged. For nearly a decade, he was persona non grata in mainstream entertainment. But Meredith wasn't built to sit quietly in the shadows. He reinvented himself on the stage and in independent productions, working wherever someone would let him perform. He became a symbol of resilience, outlasting the Blacklist and ultimately returning to Hollywood in triumph, picking up Emmy nominations and iconic roles late in his career. What makes Meredith's story remarkable isn't just his comeback, it's that he never apologized for his convictions or friendships. For him, integrity mattered more than approval. Burgess Meredith was proof that some talents are too big for even the coldest blacklist to hold back. Sam Wanamaker. Sam Wanamaker's American dream was cut short by paranoia. A rising star as an actor and director in post-war Hollywood, Wanamaker seemed unstoppable until the House Un-American Activities Committee set its sights on him. Wanamaker's activism for labor rights and support for blacklisted friends made him a target. His crime? Speaking out for fairness and refusing to betray his conscience. The pressure mounted. Facing hostile questions and growing suspicion, Wanamaker made a life-changing decision. He left the U.S. for England. His career in Hollywood was effectively over. But Wanamaker didn't just survive, he thrived overseas. In the UK, he became a celebrated director, actor, and the driving force behind the rebuilding of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. Though he achieved great things abroad, the wound of being forced out of his own country never healed. Wanamaker would later say that the Blacklist cut to the quick, leaving a scar that never faded. Decades passed before he worked again in the United States. Wanamaker's story is a classic lesson. The Blacklist couldn't silence him, it just changed his stage. He transformed exile into legacy, and his work continues to inspire actors and activists on both sides of the Atlantic. Hollywood lost out, but the world gained a visionary. Gale Sondergaard. Gale Sondergaard's Hollywood rise was the stuff of legends. She became the very first winner of the Best Supporting Actress Oscar and seemed destined for a long career filled with juicy roles. But as the 1940s wore on, the tide shifted. Sondergaard and her husband, screenwriter Herbert Biberman, were both accused of communist sympathies. Hollywood wanted her to denounce him and clear her name. She refused. The Blacklist was swift and brutal. Sondergaard went from Oscar winner to outcast in a heartbeat. Studios slammed their doors and scripts dried up. She found herself on the outside looking in, watching her promising career disappear, not because of a scandal or poor performance, but because she stood by her principles and her partner. Rather than bow to pressure, Sondergaard walked away. She and Biberman stuck together, founding small theater companies and working with blacklisted artists who couldn't get a foot in Hollywood's door. Her defiance turned her into an icon for loyalty and quiet resistance. Years later, she made a comeback in independent films, her reputation as unbreakable as ever. Gale Sondergaard's story is a sharp reminder that the Blacklist didn't just go after loudmouths or headline grabbers, it targeted anyone who refused to play along. She turned her exile into a badge of honor and proved that integrity sometimes costs more than a statue on your mantle. Revere had the face of everyone's favorite wise aunt, but her mind was sharper than any studio executive ever guessed. With an Oscar to her name and a list of acclaimed performances, she seemed unstoppable. But Revere was more than an actress. She was a proud defender of the underdog and a fierce advocate for free speech. She spoke up for actors' rights as a Screen Actors Guild board member and made no secret of her left-leaning politics. When the Red Scare swept through Hollywood, Revere was called before HUAC. She refused to testify, stating that her loyalty was to the Constitution, not to a committee looking to scare artists into silence. That simple act cost her everything. Blacklisted, Revere found herself unable to land film or TV work. Her name vanished from marquees, and her talent went unseen by a generation. But she didn't disappear. Revere returned to her roots, teaching, acting, and working in the theater, shaping a new generation of artists. When Hollywood finally relented, she was welcomed back, older, wiser, and as unapologetic as ever. Anne Revere's story is a masterclass in standing your ground. She lost her Hollywood career for speaking out, but gained the respect of anyone who values courage over comfort. The Blacklist tried to erase her, but she made sure her principles outlasted any blacklist. Ruth Gordon. Long before she became everyone's favorite quirky grandma in Harold and Maude, Ruth Gordon was a force behind the scenes, a playwright, actress, and screenwriter who pushed boundaries and refused to be intimidated by power. She and her husband, Garson Kanan, were creative firebrands in the 1940s, producing work that often challenged the status quo. But challenging the system came with a price. Gordon's outspoken nature, support for artistic freedom, and activism in progressive circles put her squarely in the crosshairs of Hollywood's blacklist culture. Studios grew wary, projects fell apart. For a time, Gordon's Hollywood career was sidelined, and she was forced to find creative fulfillment on the stage and in independent circles. Yet Gordon was never one to accept defeat. She wrote, she acted, she directed, finding ways around Hollywood's closed doors and turning obstacles into opportunity. When the Blacklist era faded, she returned in grand style, winning an Oscar late in life and redefining what it meant to be a late bloomer in show business. Ruth Gordon's legacy is simple. Talent and guts win out, even when the system tries to close you out. She made sure the world knew that the Blacklist wasn't the end. It was just another act in a much bigger, wilder show. Hollywood may love a comeback story, but it fears those who speak out. These stars risked everything, trading fame for truth, and forced the industry to reckon with its own silence. Which story shocked you most? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood legends. The real rebels never fade away.